Hello and welcome to the Sex Within Marriage podcast. My name is JD and I blog over at uncoveringintimacy.com. And during July and a bit of August, we ran a survey about people's BDSM experiences. Depending on who you ask, it was either extensive or just dipping our toes into the topic. In the end, we received over 1,000 completed survey responses from a wide range of couples. Some of them, BDSM is a part of their daily life. Others were engaging in BDSM activities, but didn't think what they were doing qualified as BDSM. Others wished they were doing such things, but didn't know how to start. And there were also those who thought it was disgusting that I even considered asking questions about such a topic, and whether or not I was actually a Christian. And just as a note, if you're in the How Do We Start group, or if you're already engaging in these practices, or you just want a safe place to discuss them and ask questions, don't miss the end of the podcast. For the last 3 weeks or so, I've spent evenings and weekends digging through the data, coding it, doing pivot tables, building charts, running correlation formulas, and more, trying to get what I can out of it. It's aptly called data mining sometimes because often it feels like sifting through a lot of rocks and dirt just to find a nugget of something valuable contained therein. So today I'm going to share some of what I found. Not all of it, because most people won't be interested in the literally dozens of pages of data analysis and comments that I've shared in the forum. If you are interested, then become a supporter and you can get access to that, as well as all the comments that people left in the survey. Instead, in the podcast, I'm going to go through the intro that I did in the blog post, a description of what BDSM is, some of the arguments, some of the highlights of the data, and if you want more, you can go check out the blog post, which is 8,000 words. It'll probably take you at least half an hour to read through, and it is extensive. And there's a link in the show notes if you want to read it all. Before we get to that, though, I want to let you know about a different opportunity. For those who follow us on social media, you know that I've been on a mission to lose weight, and I've been sharing my progress once a week there. I'm trying to lose weight, get stronger, and generally more fit. I'm down over 15 pounds now, lifting twice the weight I started, and I'm losing inches off my waist. So it's been pretty cool. I've also changed my eating habits. I never feel hungry. I don't feel like I'm dieting. I just changed how I live. And some people are asking me how I'm doing it, and it's thanks to my friend Esteban. He's a personal fitness coach that I met because we were both speakers at an event, and he's running a 14-day energy challenge starting soon. In 2 weeks, if you show up and do the work, you will have more energy, feel stronger, and be more fit. You'll also have a lot of fun. If you're interested in checking it out, there's a link in the show notes for you. So back to the survey. Before we get to the stats, I wanted to answer a question that people have. Why do we do this? Why do we run these surveys? And after a decade of running them, surveys about sex, I think what people most want out of the surveys are two things. And the first is they want to know, am I normal? Everyone wants to know that they're not weird. They want to know that whether they spend their Friday nights breaking out cuffs, collars, and rope, or just having good old vanilla sex, they're not the only ones. And the truth is, there are people on both sides of the spectrum, and more than you think on either side. And in this survey in particular, I think people also want to know, is it okay that we're doing these things? And then the second one is, what else is there? I think it's part of our nature to want to grow and expand and experience all that there is to offer. Sex is not something that's easily talked about or discussed in Christian circles. And while porn is nearly as ubiquitous inside of churches as outside, unfortunately, it's not a good source to learn things from. Surveys like this give couples ideas or a jumping point for discussing what they might want to try next, soon, someday, or maybe, or decide together that they have no interest. Marriages grow or they stagnate. And I'm not saying that you have to do anything in this survey or even that something sexual is the next thing that you should try. But if your marriage isn't experiencing anything new ever, that's likely either causing or indicating a problem. And that includes in the bedroom. And I know some of you are reading this and thinking, there's no way my spouse would even talk about this. And maybe not, or maybe just not yet. I know I'm constantly amazed at how far our marriage has progressed, considering its rough start. Don't give up hope, but also don't assume that it will just happen on its own. Get help if you're stuck. And there's a link in the show notes if you want to book a coaching call with me about this or anything else. Now, with that out of the way, let's talk about what is BDSM. When people think of BDSM, they often think of leather suits, masks, chains, whips, pain, humiliation, and more. However, BDSM is a very wide umbrella that covers a lot more widely utilized behaviors, dynamics, and activities than it seems a lot of people think. I saw a lot of comments and answers that made it clear that they were engaging in BDSM activities, but didn't consider them BDSM because it didn't fit the extreme media view of BDSM, whips, chains, sex slaves, and the like. At its core, BDSM is an overlapping acronym that stands for bondage and discipline. So that's any sort of restraining, pinning, holding, cuffs, blindfolds, being told not to move, or even just pretending to be tied up. For example, I know from the comments, many wives reach up and grab bed sheets or headboards as if they were cuffed but without cuffs. Also, anytime you've said, "Oh, you're being naughty, I'm going to have to do X to you," that's discipline. Making up excuses for spankings, it's the same thing. The next two pieces of the acronym are dominance and submission. So this is any delineation of a sort of imbalance that you're playing with. For example, wives, how many of you have said, "What are you going to do to me tonight?" That's dominance and submission, DS. You're initiating a power dynamic. If you're using cuffs, ropes, blindfolds, there's almost always an element of DS play to this. Playful invitations of, "Well, I did X for you, so now you owe me Y," can be considered DS play because there's now an imbalance between the two of you. Now, these are all playing, these are consensual, this is not coercive. That's a different thing. That's abuse, not BDSM. And the last two are sadism and masochism. Hair pulling, light spanks, hard thrusting in that hurts in a good way sort of way. Nipple pinching that has a mix of pain and pleasure. All these things fall within this pairing. It's using sensations that would typically be considered negative to heighten pleasure. And as you can hear, that's a pretty broad umbrella term that covers many topics that we have discussed on the blog and the podcast, and people ask questions about. And of course, all of these can be more extreme as well. Bondage and discipline can also include being tied down and caned. Dominance and submission might include master and slave relationships. Sadomasochism can extend into being aroused by causing someone pain and even being aroused by being tortured. But those are extremes. We can't define the entire category by the extremes. Also, BDSM is like a buffet. It's not a preset meal. You can use blindfolds and never touch any of the rest of the stuff. You're still engaging in BDSM play. And that's another topic I want to hit on. BDSM is a type of play. I saw many comments in the survey saying that they were only interested in this stuff in a playful way. It is all play. Whether it's erotic, painful, or even serious, it's still play. The entire point is that both spouses want to engage in it and are enjoying themselves. A large constant in any BDSM resource is that they focus on consent. If you are both consenting, which should mean that you both want to engage in it and it's not coerced, then it's just play. If you're not enjoying it, then I think that's an issue. And that worries me a bit because about 1.5% of the husbands and 3% of the wives who answered our survey said that they were engaging in some of these activities begrudgingly. If you don't want to do something, then don't. Sex shouldn't be coerced. Now, you may have various reasons for wanting to. For example, I asked in the survey both if you enjoyed an activity, but also if it turned you on. Why? Because arousal non-concordance is a thing. Some things can turn you on that maybe you aren't too interested in. Other things you may think are fun, but don't turn you on. Now, should you engage in things that turn you on physically, but you're uncomfortable with mentally? I'm not addressing this at this time because that is a complex topic. But the point is, it's understandable that some people might say, I'm not a big fan of that, but man, does it get me aroused. So they may choose to do something that they wouldn't consider something they like. Or maybe you do something because you know your spouse loves it and you like seeing them enjoy it. Maybe you two trade off on things. You do things for them that you don't get much out of, but then they do things for you that you don't get much out of. Whatever the situation, those aren't begrudgingly given. They are mindfully chosen, even if it doesn't line up with their preferences. Begrudgingly doing anything is problematic. It makes you start to resent the person that you're doing it for. So don't do it, because begrudgingly doing something for someone else is not loving them. Either choose to do it because you love them, and then be happy to do it for them, or don't do it. Now, after that public service announcement, let's get on to some stats. In total, we had 1,151 people complete the survey. 356 of them were women, 786 of them were men, giving us a bit less than a 1-to-2 ratio of women to men. It's not the best we've done in terms of balance, but it's not the worst. And ladies, I would love to hear more female voices in future surveys. On average, people said they had sex about 1.9 times per week. People are always curious in that stat. I think this is interesting because it was closer to 2.5 times per week when we started running surveys a decade ago. And I'm wondering if this is a shift in marriages or a shift in my audience. Frankly, I'd love to expand to people who are having less sex because I think those are the marriages that need more help. So if that's the case, fantastic. If it's marriages as a whole that are getting worse, that's sad. Now, for the rest of it, I'm not going to quote a bunch of numbers because it just becomes me rattling off percentages and they will become meaningless because it's just too many numbers. If you're a numbers person, go to the blog post. All the numbers are there. If I'm missing any that you want, write a comment in the blog post. I will get them for you. So when I ask people about bondage, I ask them, if you or your spouse have ever used anything to restrict your or their movements during sex. Only half said no, and about 40% said yes, that they do. The rest were people who had tried in the past and don't anymore. So that's quite a bit. That's almost a 50-50 split. And the most common implements were blindfolds, cuffs, pinning and holding, rope, being simply told not to move, and under the bed restraint systems. And I thought pinning and holding and being told not to move would be higher than blindfolds and cuffs because it requires no gear, but I was wrong. I was also surprised that rope ranked so high because cuffs are rather easy. But with rope, you both need to know knots, and these are not your Boy Scout type knots. They're not the knots you're using to tie down loads. Doing a single column, double column ties is quite different than anything that you will have learned in most places, especially to do it in a way that will not cut off blood flow or cause nerve damage. If you're tying down a kayak, you don't really care about nerve damage or blood flow. It's not a concern. So that said, if you are playing with rope and you don't know about these things, please stop until you do. Wives said that they were restrained about twice as often as husbands said they were, but the vast majority of both, about 80% of wives and 90% of men who get restrained during sex, say that they enjoy it. And about the same percentages say that it turns them on to be restrained. On the other hand, just over half of women said that they enjoyed restraining their spouse. So they definitely preferred to be restrained more than do the restraining on average. Of course, individual women are individuals, and so they may have different preferences than the average. And similarly, only about half of the women said it turned them on to restrain their spouse. On the other hand, the men seem to be just happy to be there. Whether you're tying them up, they're tying you up, 90% of them said they are enjoying it and they're turned on. So, yeah, the men are just happy to be there. The women definitely seem to have a preference to be the one being restrained rather than to do the restraint. Again, on average, not every single individual woman. Also, I found it interesting that when the wife is doing the restraining, twice as many are doing it begrudgingly versus men doing it for their wife. And on to dominance and submission statistics. On this one, about a quarter said yes, that they do this. 3/4 said that no, that they don't. And on average, they said they play with these kind of dynamics about once a week. And again, the men tended to take the dominant role. The men said that 71% of the time they were in the dominant role. The women said they were in the dominant role only 25% of the time. So 75% of the time they were in the submissive role. And this was consistent with all the stats that we saw towards this. There was a large lean towards men being in the dominant role. They seem to enjoy being in the dominant role more than women on average. Also, we saw in this one a large number of wives, about 13%, who were begrudgingly being kind of forced into the dominant role when they didn't want to be. And this just continued on. Men tend to be more aroused by being in the dominant role. They enjoy it more. The wives, on the other hand, felt that maybe it was a little arousing. More of them felt neutral about it, and some of them actually found it a turnoff. Whereas the wives in a submissive role, the majority of them stated that they really enjoy being in that role. Almost none said that they did it begrudgingly, only about 2%, which is still too high, but it's much better than the 13% that we saw when they were forced into the dominant role. Now, where men and women were evenly matched is that they both were turned on by being submissive. And that makes sense to me because many people would enjoy just sitting back, shutting their brains off, and doing as they are told by someone who loves them and is just going to make them feel good. However, being in the dominant position takes work. And I don't mean physical work, though it can, but rather the planning, the responsibility, the worrying about whether or not you're going to build something amazing for both of you. Some are built to enjoy that. They like the control, they like the responsibility, or at the very least, it's a decent trade-off. For others, that is a job, and they do that all day, and why would they want to do it at night as well? For them, letting go and letting someone else take on all the responsibility and stress, well, that's like a vacation. And I know that's an oversimplification. Many find it hard to switch gears still, or just go with the flow, but if you can get into that headspace, most seem to enjoy it. On top of that, for a lot of spouses who feel like maybe they always have to drive the intimacy in the relationship, they'd give up that role in a heartbeat for a night if it meant that they could feel their spouse desired them enough to take on the role of being dominant. Now, at the end, there were quite a few people who were quite against dominance and submission play who left their comments in the survey, and I addressed them in the blog post, often with comments from people who would counter-argue everything they said. But we don't have time to go everything in this podcast episode, or else it would be over an hour long. So, as with everything else, if you want to see them, go check out the blog post. One of the most interesting things I found was that those who engage in dominance and submission play tend to have sex far more often than those who don't. It's not a hard and fast rule, of course, but on average, they have sex about 75% more than those who don't. That's the difference of about 1.5 times per week to nearly 3 times per week. And I'm not saying DS is the cure to infrequent sex, although it certainly can be used in that manner if both spouses are interested. But there is a general trend that the more people are open to sexual expression, the more they tend to have sex. The more they're willing to explore and try new things, the better their sex life goes. To a point, that is. Once they start opening up their marriage up to more people and things like that, then things tend to go really bad very quickly. But if you stick with biblical principles in marriages, just between the two of you, only things used to build up, not tear down, generally be loving, things like that, then it works pretty well. Conversely, those who tend to stick to a small repertoire tend to get bored, and then even that small repertoire tends to shrink, and that frequency tends to drop along with it. And that leads to maybe one of the coolest charts of the blog post that I just happened to find when I was writing it up and looking for correlations. It actually wasn't in my original analysis, but there were two very clear trends when I looked at these numbers segregated by decades of marriage. Those who don't engage in dominance and submission play slowly see their frequency drop over time. This is so typical that it becomes a running joke in sitcoms, plots of movies, and more. It's nearly universal. People know that the longer you're married, probably the less sex you're going to have. This is not true for the crowd of people who are engaging in dominance and submission play. It tends to start off with a bang. The 20 or 30-year-olds having lots of sex, way more than those who don't engage in it. And then it drops down to similar levels as though not engaging in dominance and submission play, but then it starts going up. And it continues going up until they hit the ages of about 60 to 70 when it finally drops down. But it drops to a point that's still higher than the 20 or 30-year-olds who are in the crowd of people not playing with dominance and submission. And to me, that is astounding. I never expected to see such a marked difference. I expected a little bit, but this is just, well, honestly, the numbers geek in me was super excited about this because it was such a clear divergence. And then we got into the section that made people really uncomfortable based on the comments. ask people if they engage in any play that intentionally causes pain or discomfort. And right off the bat, some of the men in particular got aggressive with their comments about it being part of the devil's toolbox, that such play is degrading and sick, that it is disordered, that people who engage in this are deviants, and more. And interestingly enough, it is only the men who said such things. The women were simply either interested or not interested, but didn't share any judgment about others who were, at least not in this section. What I did get from the women is a lot of cognitive dissonance. For example, they would answer no to engaging in any play that causes discomfort or pain, but then their comments made it clear that they do enjoy some pain and discomfort, just not a lot of it, and it's not something they're seeking out. It's not the focus of it, but if their hair gets pulled a little too hard, they kind of like it. If they get spanked, they kind of like it. If their nipples get pinched a little hard, they kind of like it. And in the question, I didn't say anything about it being the purpose or the primary intention, only that if you did it, knowing it could cause pain or discomfort. And I say all that to say there are definitely some people who said that they don't engage in this sort of play, and yet clearly they do. In the end, though, we have to go with what's reported, knowing that's a little bit off. And about 1/4 of the responses said that they do engage in this sort of play. The majority said that they do things like spanking, nipple play, and hair pulling. Now, when I asked how often do you engage in these, the wives actually said about half of the time, and the men said about 1/4 of the time. And this made me wonder if there's a communication gap here. There is, after all, a stereotype out there of men being brutish, uncaring, aggressive, etc. And I wonder if it's simply that they don't realize. I mean, if men are literally only realizing half the time that something is uncomfortable for their wife, well, that might explain this gap. Of course, the responsibility likely falls on both sides. Men can learn to be more attentive, pay more attention, and women can speak up more. Now, when I asked them who is the performer of these acts, the wives said that they were about 1/4 of the time, the men that they were more than half of the time. However, it's not evenly distributed. Nearly half the wives said that they were in the recipient role 100% of the time. For the men, only 16% of them were the recipient of this type of play 100% of the time. On average, the men definitely seemed to like being in charge of these activities more than the women did. More of the men said that they enjoyed it, and more of the women said they begrudgingly do it for their spouse than the men do. That is, they preferred to be on the receiving end than the giving end. And this was mirrored when I asked them about how arousing it was. The men tended to find being the performer of this type of play more arousing, and the wives tended to prefer to be the recipient. They found that more arousing than doing it to their husband. And lastly, I asked some general questions about people's experiences with BDSM and how it affected their relationship. About 40% said it had no effect, positive or negative. And just over half said it was a positive experience. Very few found it negative, under 5%, and for many of them, this was tied to some prior traumatic experience. I also asked whether or not they felt conflicted about BDSM in their marriage. 80% of them didn't. For the other 20%, they had a lot of reasons for why. Literally over 100 comments, and there were a lot of good and valid reasons to be conflicted about it. Not things that were stopping them, but things that they were wanting to know, wondering. They were curious where the lines were, where they get crossed, whether they'd crossed that line, and is it still ahead of them, or are they standing on it? And that's a topic for another day, but if you want to talk about that kind of stuff, don't miss the end of the podcast. And at the end of the day, these are controversial topics. We as Christians have a long and very complicated relationship with sex. I mean, let's face it, Christianity has a long and complicated history with almost everything. We tend, as a group, not to know when we're being righteous or self-righteous. And sex is particularly difficult because we tend to look to Jesus as an example, and he didn't have sex. He wasn't even conceived by sex. So we use biblical principles as best as we can. But that's also complicated because each individual has their own experiences and perceptions. For every comment that says something negative about BDSM or their views of it, I had another to balance it in using the same direction of argument. If someone said it was ungodly, someone else said it was a gift from God. If someone said it was degrading, another person said it made them feel incredibly loved. If someone said it was restrictive, another said it made them feel free. And I guess my point is that we need to all live by our own convictions because there isn't a clear-cut directive either way in the Bible. While some of those against BDSM make comments about it being unloving, sick, deviant, etc., many of those who are engaging in it find it loving, liberating, and it builds up their marriage. Do I think it can be done wrong? Absolutely. I think there are things in the BDSM buffet that should probably not be touched. As with everything else, we should seek to do things lovingly, and I think what's often misunderstood about these types of activities is that people think it's unloving, and that the one in the dominant role is being selfish and setting aside the needs and the wants of the one in the submissive role. And I hope you've seen in the survey that often it's the other way around, that they are doing it because it meets the desires, needs, and wants of their spouse. And if you're not convinced of that, I encourage you to go check out the blog post, read some more of the comments that I posted there. And if you want to see more, join the forum. You can read all the comments. And lastly, Christina and I have been talking about these results. She hasn't read everything because, well, it's a lot. But I've been sharing bits and pieces that I think are interesting. But one thing that has come up a lot is many people wish that there was a safe place to learn more. And we thought, what if we could be a space where it could be discussed openly and honestly within a Christian context? What if we built a space that was moderated, private enough to keep the trolls out, but public enough that you couldn't start any inappropriate hidden conversations? All discussions would have to be in the open. And I know this is for a subset of the population. Not everyone is interested in this, and some are quite uncomfortable with it, some for very good reasons. And so I don't want to make it a section of the blog or to continue in this direction on the podcast, at least not in the capacity that some people seem to want. I also don't have time to start a whole new website. So my thought is to create a new section of our supporter forum for discussions along these lines. Its purpose will be discussion and education, not entertainment, just like the rest of what I do. I can't control how everyone receives it, but I can control its intent at least. You'd be anonymous except for to me, which is the same as every account you create in any of my systems. If you don't trust me with this information, well, then you probably shouldn't ever even browse my site again. Don't sign up for the newsletter or purchase anything from the shop, because as soon as you do, I have your information. But to everyone else, you'd be anonymous. The cost would be low. Right now, we have it set at a minimum of $1 a month, which honestly, we get about half of that after transaction fees. After the cost of hosting the forum, frankly, you're being subsidized by people who opt to donate more. The point isn't to get rich. The point is to keep out the trolls. People act a lot nicer when you have their billing address. If you have an interest in that, there is the link in the show notes in whatever app you're listening to this on, or there's a link in the blog post if you want to go over to the site and check it out there. We've already got over 100 people interested in this at the time of recording. If you aren't interested, don't click on the link. If you're not sure, click it. It's not an obligation. It's just a measure of interest and a way for me to contact you with more details if there is enough interest. And that is it. Those are the survey results. Well, at least the ones I picked to share here. If you want more, like I said, go check out the blog post. A link to that is in the show notes as well as usual. If you're curious about anything I said, want clarification, want me to dig into correlations, want to chastise me, or for even discussing this, or literally anything else, please comment on the blog post. I miss the era when we had more comments and more discussion. It makes it feel more like a community. And if you're not interested in commenting, well, thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.